Before we start, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling me, have you ever been disrespected in your own child's home? Have you witnessed a parent being mistreated by their in-laws? What would you do in this situation? Comment your country, your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe, because this story will shake you to your core. Now, let's begin. Margaret Chen sat in the cramped storage room that used to house Christmas decorations in old photo albums, staring at the single bare mattress on the floor that was now supposed to be her bed. Her hands trembled as she held the small frame containing a photo of her late husband, David, and their daughter Emily on her wedding day. Just 3 hours ago, this frame had sat on the nightstand in her bedroom, the bedroom she'd occupied for the past 2 years since moving in with Emily and her husband, Brandon. That bedroom now belonged to Brandon's mother, Diane. Margaret was 72 years old. She had raised Emily as a single mother after David died of cancer when Emily was just 12. She had worked 2 jobs, one as a school cafeteria worker during the day and another cleaning offices at night to put Emily through college. She had sacrificed her own dreams, her own comfort, her own retirement savings to ensure her daughter had every opportunity she never had. And Emily had thrived. She'd graduated with honors, landed a prestigious job at a marketing firm, and married Brandon Whitmore, a successful financial consultant from a wealthy family. 2 years ago, when Margaret's arthritis had become so severe that she could no longer manage the stairs in her small apartment, and when her fixed income could barely cover her medications, Emily had insisted she move in. "Mom, you took care of me my whole life," Emily had said, tears in her eyes. "Now it's my turn to take care of you. You're moving in with us, and I won't hear another word about it." Margaret had been hesitant. She knew Brandon merely tolerated her presence, despite his polite smiles and cordial greetings. She saw how his jaw tightened when she asked Emily for help with something, how he'd make subtle comments about 3 being a crowd, or joke about needing to build a mother-in-law suite in the garage. But Emily had been insistent, and Margaret, exhausted from pain and financial stress, had finally agreed. For 2 years, Margaret had tried to make herself as invisible as possible. She helped with cooking and cleaning despite her arthritis. She never asked for rides unless absolutely necessary. She ate small portions at dinner and always praised Brandon's accomplishments. She babysat their 3-year-old son, Lucas, whenever they needed a night out. She contributed what she could from her small Social Security check toward groceries, but it was never enough. This morning, everything had changed. Margaret had been at her weekly physical therapy appointment when Brandon had struck. She'd returned to find her bedroom completely transformed. The soft blue walls she'd painted herself were now covered with Diane's expensive floral wallpaper. Margaret's simple furniture had been replaced with Diane's ornate bedroom set. Her clothes had been stuffed haphazardly into garbage bags and dumped in the storage room. Her books, her photos, her small television, her comfortable reading chair, all of it, gone or relocated to that tiny storage room that smelled of mothballs and had no proper ventilation. What happened?" Margaret had stammered when she found Brandon supervising movers who were bringing in the last of Diane's belongings. Brandon had barely looked at her. "Change of plans, Margaret. My mother is moving in. She needs a proper room with an attached bathroom because of her mobility issues. You understand. But this is my room. Where am I supposed to?" "We've set you up in the storage room," Brandon had interrupted, his tone making it clear this wasn't a discussion. "It'll be cozy. Besides, Mom needs to be on this floor near us. Doctor's orders. Margaret's heart had pounded. Does Emily know about this? Brandon's smile had been cold. Emily understands that my mother's health comes first. She's at work, but we discussed it. Now, if you'll excuse me, Mom will be here in an hour, and I want everything perfect. That had been a lie. Margaret discovered the truth when Emily came home from work at 6 o'clock, walked past the storage room without even knowing her mother was there, and went straight to her old bedroom. Margaret heard her daughter's shocked voice through the thin walls. Brandon, what is this? Where's my mom's furniture? Why is your mother's stuff here? Brandon's response was muffled, but his tone was placating. Then came Diane's voice, sharp, entitled, dripping with false sweetness. Oh, Emily dear, I hope you don't mind. Brandon insisted I take this room since it has the attached bathroom. My hip, you know. I simply can't manage stairs or walking long distances. I'm sure Margaret doesn't mind the storage room. It's quite charming, really. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Margaret held her breath, waiting for Emily to defend her, to demand Brandon move Diane elsewhere, to restore things to how they were. But when Emily finally spoke, her voice was tired, defeated. I wish you had talked to me first, Brandon. But if your mother needs the accessible room, then I guess we'll make it work. Margaret felt something inside her chest crack. Her daughter, her precious daughter, whom she'd sacrificed everything for, had just chosen her husband's comfort over her mother's dignity. The tears came then, silent and hot, streaming down Margaret's weathered face as she sat alone in that storage room, surrounded by garbage bags of her belongings. She looked at the photo in her hands, at David's kind smile, at Emily's radiant happiness on her wedding day, and wondered when everything had gone so terribly wrong. She didn't know it yet, but this betrayal would set in motion a chain of events that would tear the family apart, reveal devastating secrets, and ultimately teach them all a lesson about respect, gratitude, and the true meaning of family that none of them would ever forget. Outside the storage room, she could hear them laughing. Brandon, Diane, and even Emily, as they shared wine in the living room, celebrating Diane's move-in as if Margaret didn't exist. Margaret wiped her tears, her jaw setting with a determination she hadn't felt in years. She had been a doormat long enough. She had swallowed her pride, accepted disrespect, and minimized her own needs for the sake of keeping peace. But this was too much. She didn't know what she was going to do yet, but she knew with absolute certainty that things were about to change. The next morning, Margaret woke at 5 a.m. on the bare mattress in the storage room, her entire body aching from the cold, hard surface and the lack of proper support for her arthritic joints. She lay there for a moment, listening to the house wake up around her. The sound of Brandon's alarm, the shower running, little Lucas calling for his daddy, the sounds of a family starting their day, a family she was apparently no longer truly part of. She forced herself up, biting back a groan as her knees protested. The storage room had no mirror, no proper lighting, just a single bare bulb that hung from the ceiling. She dressed in the dim light, pulling clothes from one of the garbage bags, trying to smooth out the wrinkles with her hands. She'd always taken pride in her appearance, but looking down at her wrinkled blouse and slacks, she felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. When she emerged from the storage room, she found the house already in its morning chaos. Brandon was in the kitchen making coffee, dressed in one of his expensive suits. Lucas was in his high chair, eating cereal. There was no sign of Emily. She'd apparently already left for an early morning meeting. And there, in the living room, in a luxurious silk robe, sat Diane Whitmore, looking like a queen, surveying her kingdom. "Oh, Margaret," Diane said, her voice dripping with false concern. "You look absolutely exhausted, dear. That storage room must be quite uncomfortable. Perhaps you should look into some assisted living facilities. I hear they're quite nice these days, and they have proper beds." Margaret's hands clenched at her sides, but she forced a polite smile. "Good morning, Diane." Brandon glanced up from his coffee. "Mom, can you take Lucas to daycare today? I have an early meeting, and Emily's already gone." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Margaret looked at her grandson, who smiled at her with his innocent 3-year-old grin, and she felt her anger soften slightly. None of this was Lucas's fault. "Of course," she said quietly. "Oh, and Margaret," Diane called out as Margaret moved toward Lucas. "Would you mind terribly doing my laundry today? Simply can't manage the stairs to the basement with my hip. You understand." Margaret stopped, her back to them. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting to see if she'd object. The old Margaret would have immediately agreed, eager to help, desperate to be useful. But something had shifted inside her last night. "I'll see what I can do," she said neutrally, neither agreeing nor refusing. She heard Diane's intake of breath at the non-committal response, but Margaret didn't turn around. She focused on Lucas, getting him cleaned up and ready for daycare, trying to pour all her love and attention into her grandson to avoid thinking about her own hurt. As she drove Lucas to daycare in her old, battered car, Brandon and Emily always took the nice vehicles. Lucas chatted happily about his toys and his friends. When they arrived, he hugged her tight. "I love you, Grandma Maggie," he said, using his special name for her. "I love you too, sweet boy," Margaret whispered, holding him close, fighting back tears. After dropping Lucas off, Margaret didn't go straight home. Instead, she drove to a coffee shop and sat there for 2 hours, just thinking. She opened her phone and looked at her bank account. $847. That was all she had in the world. Her Social Security check wouldn't come for another 2 weeks, and it was only $100 a month. She paid Emily $400 of that for room and board. Brandon had insisted on it, leaving her with $700 for medications, personal items, and the small prepaid phone plan she maintained. She couldn't afford to move out. Even the cheapest apartments in the area were $900 a month, not including utilities. The assisted living facilities Diane had so sweetly suggested started at $3,000 a month. She was trapped. Margaret sat there, stirring her coffee, watching young mothers come in with their babies, business people rushing through on their way to important jobs, teenagers laughing with their friends. She felt invisible, irrelevant, discarded. Her phone buzzed. A text from Brandon. "Where are you? Mom needs her medication from the pharmacy. Pick it up on your way home." Not a please. Not a thank you. Just an order. Margaret stared at that text for a long moment. Then she typed back, "I have errands. Emily can pick it up after work." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The response came within seconds. "Mom needs it now. This is important." Margaret turned off her phone. She sat in that coffee shop until noon, savoring the small act of rebellion, knowing it would make Brandon angry, knowing there would be consequences. But for those few hours, sitting in that coffee shop, drinking mediocre coffee she'd bought with her own money, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt free. When she finally returned home at 1 o'clock, she found Brandon's car still in the driveway. He usually left for work by 8. Her stomach tightened as she walked inside. Brandon was waiting in the kitchen, his face red with anger. Diane sat at the kitchen table, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue in an obvious display of distress. "Where the hell have you been?" Brandon demanded. "My mother has been in pain all morning because you couldn't be bothered to pick up her medication." Margaret set her purse down, slowly, carefully. "I was out. I'm not your servant, Brandon." The room went silent. Diane's mouth dropped open. Brandon stared at her as if she'd just spoken in a foreign language. "Excuse me?" Brandon said, his voice dangerous. "You heard me?" Margaret said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm not your servant. I'm Emily's mother, and I'm living in this house as family, not as your personal assistant." Brandon's eyes narrowed. "You're living in this house because we're generous enough to give you a place to stay. You're living here because Emily feels sorry for you. Don't forget that." Each word was like a knife, but Margaret stood her ground. "I contribute to this household. I pay rent. I help with Lucas. I clean and cook. I've earned my place here. Your place is whatever I say it is." Brandon shot back. "This is my house, my name on the mortgage, my money that pays for everything, including the food you eat and the electricity that powers that storage room you're sleeping in." "Brandon," Diane interjected, though her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Perhaps that's a bit harsh, dear." "No, Mom. She needs to hear this," Brandon continued, advancing on Margaret. "You're here on borrowed time, old woman. The only reason you haven't been sent to some state-run nursing home is because Emily has a soft heart, but she'll see reason eventually, especially once she realizes how ungrateful you are." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Where is Emily? Does she know you're speaking to me this way?" "Emily is at work, like a productive member of society," Brandon sneered. "And when she gets home, she's going to hear all about how you refused to help my mother, how you've been disrespectful, and how you're becoming a burden this family can't afford." "I want to talk to my daughter," Margaret said firmly. "You'll talk to her when I say you can," Brandon replied. "Now, you're going to apologize to my mother. You're going to go get her medication, and you're going to remember your place in this house. Or you can pack your garbage bags and find somewhere else to live. Your choice." Margaret looked at Diane, who was watching the exchange with barely concealed glee. She looked at Brandon, who stood there with his arms crossed, so certain of his power over her, and she made a decision that would change everything. "No," she said quietly. "No?" Brandon repeated, incredulous. "No, I won't apologize for nothing. No, I won't jump every time you snap your fingers. And no, I won't let you bully me anymore." Margaret picked up her purse. "I'm going to my room. Excuse me. The storage room you've confined me to, and I'm staying there until Emily comes home. I will speak to my daughter, and only my daughter, about this situation." She turned and walked toward the storage room, half expecting Brandon to physically stop her. But he just stood there, shock evident on his face. No one had ever stood up to him before. "You'll regret this," he called after her. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." Margaret closed the storage room door behind her and leaned against it, her whole body shaking. She'd done it. She'd actually stood up to him. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew there was no going back now. Outside her door, she could hear Brandon and Diane talking in urgent, angry whispers. She heard phrases like ungrateful, needs to be taught a lesson, and Emily needs to choose. Margaret sat down on her mattress and waited for her daughter to come home, praying that when the moment came, Emily would finally see what her husband had become. But part of her, the part that had seen Emily's exhausted acceptance last night, feared that her daughter had already made her choice, and Margaret was on the wrong side of it. Emily Whitmore sat in her car in the driveway of her home at 6:47 p.m., dreading going inside. She'd received 7 text messages from Brandon throughout the day, each one more insistent than the last, telling her about her mother's outrageous behavior and complete disrespect toward him and Diane. She'd also received 2 text messages from her mother. The first asking Emily to call her when she had a chance. The second simply saying, "I love you, sweetheart. Please remember that no matter what." That second message had filled Emily with a sense of dread she couldn't shake. She looked at her house, the beautiful 4-bedroom colonial in the upscale suburb, with its manicured lawn and 2-car garage. From the outside, it looked like the American dream. A successful couple, a beautiful child, financial security, everything Emily had worked so hard to achieve. But inside that house, something was rotting. Emily had felt it for months now. The growing tension, the subtle power plays, the way Brandon had slowly been pushing her mother to the margins of their family. She'd told herself she was imagining things, that her mother was just getting older and needed more patience, that Brandon was just stressed from work. She'd made excuses because facing the truth was too painful. The truth was that her husband was cruel, and she'd been too cowardly to stop it. Emily finally forced herself out of the car and walked inside. She found Brandon in the kitchen, heating up takeout. He apparently hadn't bothered to cook, even though he'd been home all day. Diane was on the couch, watching television. There was no sign of her mother or Lucas. "Where's Lucas?" Emily asked, setting down her work bag. "Your mother picked him up from daycare," Brandon said shortly. "He's in his room." "And where's Mom?" "In her room," Brandon replied, emphasis on the word her, as if to remind Emily of the change in arrangements. "We need to talk." Emily's stomach tightened. "Brandon, before you start, I need to say something. I'm not happy about what you did yesterday. Moving Mom to the storage room without even discussing it with me. Your mother was completely disrespectful to my mother today." Brandon interrupted. "She refused to pick up Mom's pain medication, left her suffering for hours, and then had the audacity to say she's not our servant. After everything we've done for her, this is how she repays us?" Diane chimed in from the couch, her voice quavering with manufactured hurt. "I've tried so hard to be kind to Margaret, Emily, but she clearly resents my presence here. I don't want to cause problems between you and your mother, but I can't live in a home where I'm treated with such hostility." Emily looked between them, feeling the familiar pressure to smooth things over, to make everyone happy, to be the peacekeeper. It was a role she'd played her entire marriage. "I'll talk to her," Emily said quietly. "Talking isn't enough anymore," Brandon said firmly. "She needs to understand her place here, or she needs to go. I'm serious, Emily. I'm not living like this. She's my mother," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And Diane is mine," Brandon countered. "But the difference is, my mother is respectful, helpful, and grateful to be here. Your mother acts like she's entitled to special treatment." Emily felt tears burning in her eyes. "She raised me alone after my father died. She worked herself to the bone to give me opportunities. She sacrificed everything for me. And you've repaid that debt," Brandon said, his tone softening slightly. "You took her in when she couldn't afford her own place. You've supported her for 2 years. But Emily, we have to think about our future. We have Lucas to consider. We're talking about maybe having another child. Your mother's needs are only going to increase as she gets older. We can't be expected to care for her indefinitely." "So, what are you saying?" Emily asked. though she was afraid she already knew. I'm saying it's time to look at other options. Assisted living, a senior apartment with services, something that gives her independence and takes the burden off of us. The burden, Emily repeated hollowly. You're calling my mother a burden. Don't twist my words, Brandon said sharply. I'm being practical. You're being emotional. Emily wanted to scream that of course she was emotional. They were talking about her mother, the woman who'd given her life, meaning and purpose. But she'd learned over the years that showing strong emotion around Brandon only made things worse. He'd accuse her of being irrational, overly sensitive, incapable of making sound decisions. I need to talk to her, Emily said again, moving toward the storage room. Emily, Brandon called after her, his voice carrying a warning. Remember whose side you're on. Emily stopped, her hand on the wall to steady herself. Whose side was she on? When had her family become a war with sides to choose? She knocked softly on the storage room door. Mom, it's me. Can I come in? There was a pause, then her mother's voice, thick with emotion. Of course, sweetheart. Emily opened the door and had to suppress a gasp. The storage room was tiny, maybe 8 by 10 feet, with no windows. A bare bulb hung from the ceiling. Her mother's belongings were still in garbage bags, piled in the corner. The mattress on the floor had a single pillow and a thin blanket, not even her mother's own comforter, which Emily had bought her last Christmas. Margaret sat on that mattress, her back against the wall, looking small and fragile and heartbreakingly. Mom, Emily breathed, tears spilling over. Oh, Mom, I didn't realize it was this bad. Come sit with me, Margaret said, patting the mattress beside her. Emily sat, and immediately her mother's arms came around her, just like when Emily was a little girl, and the world felt too big and scary. Tell me what happened today, Emily said. Margaret did, her voice steady, stating the facts without embellishment. She told Emily about Diane's request for her to do laundry, about Brandon's demanding text, about her decision to take a few hours for herself, and about Brandon's verbal attack when she returned. He said, I'm here because you feel sorry for me, Margaret finished quietly. He said, I need to remember my place, that this is his house, his money, his rules. Emily felt anger flare in her chest. He had no right to speak to you that way. But is he wrong? Margaret asked, looking at her daughter with those wise, tired eyes. Am I here just because you pity me? Am I a burden to you, Emily? No, Emily said vehemently. Mom, no. You're here because you're my family, because I love you, because after everything you've done for me, it's the least I can do. But Brandon doesn't see it that way, Margaret said gently. And you're caught in the middle. Emily was crying openly now. I don't know what to do. He's my husband. I took vows. We have a child together. But you're my mother. I can't just abandon you. Margaret took her daughter's face in her hands. Listen to me carefully, Emily. I am 72 years old. I've lived a full life. I've made my mistakes and had my triumphs. But you're still building your life. You have a husband and a son. I won't be the reason your marriage falls apart. And don't say that, Emily sobbed. Please don't say that. I'm going to look into other living arrangements, Margaret continued, her voice firm despite her own tears. There have to be options. Senior housing, maybe a roommate situation with another elderly person. Something. On your Social Security check? Mom, we both know you can't afford. Then I'll figure something out, Margaret interrupted. I'll get a part-time job. I'll apply for assistance. But I can't stay here and watch you torn apart between your husband and your mother. I won't do that to you. Emily clung to her mother, feeling like she was 8 years old again, terrified of losing the only parent she had left. There has to be another way. I'll talk to Brandon. I'll make him understand. He can be reasonable when he wants to be. Margaret didn't respond, because they both knew that wasn't true. Brandon was only reasonable when he was getting his way. They sat together for a long time, mother and daughter, both crying, both afraid, neither knowing how to fix what was broken. Finally, there was a knock on the door. Brandon's voice came through, deceptively gentle. "Emily, Lucas needs you. Bedtime." Emily pulled away from her mother, wiping her eyes. "I have to." "I know," Margaret said. "Go. Be with your son." Emily stood, then turned back. "Mom, I'm not giving up on this. I'm not giving up on us. I promise." But as Emily left the storage room and returned to her perfect house with her demanding husband and her manipulative mother-in-law, Margaret sat alone in the darkness and wondered how many promises got broken in the name of keeping the peace. She looked down at the photo of David she still clutched in her hand. "I don't know what to do," she whispered to his image. "I don't know how to protect her without destroying her." Outside her door, she heard Brandon's voice, low and intense, talking to Emily. She couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the tone, persuasive, controlling, wearing Emily down. And Margaret knew that despite Emily's promise, despite her daughter's love, the situation was only going to get worse. She just didn't know how much worse until it was almost too late. 3 days later, Margaret was folding laundry in the basement. Her own laundry, she'd made that clear, not Diane's, when she heard voices above her. Brandon and Diane were in the kitchen directly above the basement, and their conversation drifted down through the old heating vents. "Just a matter of time now," Brandon was saying. "I've been documenting everything. Every little incident, every moment of confusion, every time she's been difficult." "Are you sure this will work?" Diane asked, her voice eager. "Absolutely. I've been consulting with elder law attorneys for weeks. Once we establish a pattern of declining mental capacity and inability to care for herself, we can petition for guardianship. Then she'll have to go wherever we say. Some state facility, probably. We'll be her legal guardians, which means we'll also control her Social Security check and any other assets." Margaret's blood ran cold. She stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, a towel clutched in her hands, listening in horror. "But what about Emily?" Diane asked. "Won't she object?" Brandon laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Emily objects to everything at first, but she always comes around. She's worn down. Between her job, Lucas, and all this drama with her mother, she's exhausted. In a few more weeks, she'll be relieved when I suggest moving Margaret into a care facility. She'll probably even thank me for taking charge." "You're brilliant, son," Diane said admiringly. "And once the mother's gone, we can finally move forward with our plans for the house. That storage room would make an excellent home office for you." "Or a nursery," Brandon said, "for when we have another baby." "We?" Diane sounded surprised. "Emily and I," Brandon clarified quickly. "Though I'll need you here to help with childcare, of course. You'll be staying indefinitely." "Of course," Diane agreed. "Family takes care of family." They moved away from the kitchen, their voices fading, leaving Margaret standing in the basement, trembling with shock and rage. They were planning to have her declared mentally incompetent. They were going to take control of her life, her money, her freedom, and Brandon had been setting it up for weeks, maybe months, documenting every moment she'd been tired or confused or slow, normal things for a 72-year-old woman with arthritis, and turning them into evidence of declining capacity. Margaret's mind raced. She'd heard about guardianship abuse, how family members or scam artists would get themselves appointed as guardians of elderly people, then control their finances and isolate them in facilities. She'd thought it was something that happened to other people, people without family, people without protection. She'd never imagined her own son-in-law was planning to do it to her. Margaret's hands shook as she pulled out her phone. She needed to tell Emily. Immediately. But then she hesitated. What proof did she have? It would be her word against Brandon and Diane's. And Brandon was right. Emily was exhausted, overwhelmed, barely holding on. If Margaret came to her with accusations of a conspiracy, would Emily even believe her? Or would it just sound like the paranoid ravings of an elderly woman losing touch with reality? Exactly what Brandon wanted people to think. Margaret needed proof. Real, undeniable proof. She thought quickly. Brandon had said he'd been documenting everything. That meant he had files, records, probably on his laptop. Brandon was religious about his tech security, but Margaret had seen him enter his password dozens of times when she'd been in the room. He never thought she was paying attention, never considered her a threat. That had been his mistake. That evening, Margaret waited until Brandon went for his nightly run. 5 miles every evening at 7 o'clock, as predictable as clockwork. Diane had gone upstairs for her evening bath. Emily was reading to Lucas in his room. The house was as quiet as it ever got. Margaret slipped into Brandon's home office. His laptop was on his desk, closed, but not locked away. Margaret opened it with trembling hands, entered the password she'd memorized, BDU Finance 2021. The screen came to life. She had maybe 30 minutes before Brandon returned. Margaret wasn't tech-savvy, but she knew how to search for files. She typed Margaret into the search bar and hit enter. A folder appeared. MG Documentation. Margaret opened it, and her stomach turned. There were dozens of documents. Photos of her, looking tired or confused. Timestamped notes. MG couldn't remember what day it was. MG left stove burner on. MG seemed disoriented after waking from nap. Audio recordings of conversations where Margaret sounded tired or made small mistakes. But the worst was a document titled Petition for Guardianship, Draft, PDF. Margaret opened it and saw her worst fears confirmed. It was a legal document, not yet filed, laying out a case for why Margaret Chen was no longer capable of caring for herself and needed a court-appointed guardian. The recommended guardian, Brandon Whitmore, as her son-in-law and primary caregiver. The document twisted every normal behavior into evidence of incompetence. Her arthritis medication made her confused and sleepy. Her preference for staying in her room was social isolation and possible depression. Her difficulty hearing, sometimes, was declining cognitive function. It was all lies, but it was documented, organized, and convincing. Margaret's hands shook as she realized how much danger she was in. If Brandon filed this petition, if a judge believed it, she could lose everything: her freedom, her autonomy, her access to her own daughter. She needed to copy these files, but she didn't know how to use Brandon's email or cloud storage. In desperation, she pulled out her phone and started taking photos of the screen, capturing every document, every lie, every piece of evidence of Brandon's plan. She'd just finished photographing the guardianship petition when she heard the front door open downstairs. Brandon was home early. Margaret's heart hammered as she closed the laptop, trying to leave everything exactly as she'd found it. She could hear Brandon's footsteps on the stairs, heading toward the office. She looked around frantically. There was nowhere to hide, no way to explain her presence in his office. She was caught. The footsteps came closer. The office door started to open. Margaret did the only thing she could think of. She pretended to be confused. "Oh," she said, looking around with manufactured bewilderment. Is this the bathroom? I was looking for the bathroom." Brandon stood in the doorway, his expression suspicious. "The bathroom is down the hall, Margaret. You know that." "I'm sorry," Margaret said, playing up her age, making her voice quaver. "I get turned around in this big house. All the doors look the same." Brandon studied her, clearly trying to determine if she was lying. Margaret forced herself to meet his eyes, to look genuinely confused and apologetic. Finally, Brandon stepped aside. "Down the hall, last door on the right. Maybe you should get your eyes checked." "Yes, maybe," Margaret said meekly, shuffling past him. As she walked down the hall, she could feel his eyes on her back, watching, suspicious. But she had what she needed. Photos of his entire evil plan, stored safely on her phone. Now she just needed to figure out what to do with them. That night, lying on her mattress in the storage room, Margaret looked through the photos on her phone, her heart breaking with each swipe. Brandon hadn't just been casually cruel. He'd been systematically building a case to institutionalize her, to take control of her life, possibly for financial gain, or simply to remove her from Emily's life permanently. She thought about going to Emily immediately, showing her the evidence. But some instinct held her back. Emily was already stretched so thin, already torn between her husband and her mother. If Margaret went to her now with this bombshell, it might break her daughter completely. Margaret needed a plan. She needed help. She needed someone who could help her fight back legally, who could protect her from what Brandon was planning. And she knew exactly who to call. The next morning, while Brandon was at work and Diane was at a doctor's appointment, Margaret called her old friend, Rosa Martinez. Rosa's daughter, Carmen, was an attorney specializing in elder law. Margaret had met Carmen at Rosa's birthday party last year. "Mrs. Chen," Carmen said when she came on the line. "What a surprise. How are you?" "I need help," Margaret said quietly. "I think my son-in-law is trying to have me declared incompetent so he can institutionalize me and take control of my finances." There was a pause. Then Carmen's voice changed, becoming sharp and professional. "Tell me everything." Margaret did. She told Carmen about being moved to the storage room, about the conversation she'd overheard, about the files she'd found on Brandon's computer. She sent Carmen the photos from her phone. After reviewing everything, Carmen was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Chen, this is serious. What he's planning is essentially elder abuse and exploitation. But you're in a precarious position. If he files that petition before we can act, it could be difficult to fight." "What do I do?" Margaret asked. "First, document everything from your perspective. Write down your daily activities, showing you're cognitively intact and capable of self-care. Second, see your doctor and get a statement of your mental capacity. Third, and this is important, you need to consider moving out of that house before he can file that petition. Do you have anywhere else you can go?" Margaret thought of Rosa, who'd offered multiple times to have Margaret stay with her if she ever needed to. "Yes, I think so." "Good, because Mrs. Chen, I'm going to be honest with you. If you stay in that house, you're in danger. Not physical danger necessarily, but legal danger. He's building a case, and every day you're there gives him more ammunition. We need to take control of this situation before he does." "But what about my daughter? My grandson? I can't just leave them with him." "Your daughter is an adult who can make her own choices," Carmen said, gently but firmly. "You can't save her if you're locked in a state facility somewhere. We need to protect you first. Then we can figure out the rest." Margaret knew Carmen was right, but the thought of leaving Emily, of abandoning her daughter to Brandon's manipulation, felt like betrayal. "I need to think about this," Margaret said. "Don't think too long," Carmen warned. "I've seen cases like this move quickly once they're in motion. You need to act before he does." After hanging up, Margaret sat in her storage room, feeling the walls close in. She looked at the photos on her phone, evidence of Brandon's betrayal, proof that she was in danger. But she also thought about Emily's face 3 nights ago, tear-stained and heartbroken, caught between her mother and her husband. Margaret had a choice to make: save herself and potentially abandon Emily, or stay and fight, risking everything on the chance that Emily would finally see the truth about the man she'd married. She looked at David's photo again, asking for guidance from the husband who'd been gone for so long. And slowly, carefully, Margaret began to form a plan that would either save her family or destroy it completely. Margaret spent the next 4 days carefully preparing. She contacted Rosa, who immediately offered her spare bedroom. She packed a small bag with essentials, important documents, medications, a few changes of clothes, precious photos. She hid the bag in the back of her closet in the storage room, behind the garbage bags of belongings Brandon had never bothered to help her properly unpack. She documented everything, just as Carmen had instructed. She wrote down her daily activities, proving her competence. She made a doctor's appointment and got a letter from Dr. Patterson stating she was mentally sound and capable of independent living. She opened a new bank account at a different bank and had her Social Security deposit changed to that account, ensuring Brandon couldn't access her money. She did all of this secretly, moving carefully, never giving Brandon or Diane any reason to suspect she was planning something. But the hardest part was deciding what to tell Emily. Margaret knew that if she simply disappeared, Emily would be frantic. But if she told Emily she was leaving, Emily would try to fix things, to mediate, to make everyone happy, and in doing so, would alert Brandon to Margaret's plans. Brandon would accelerate his timeline, possibly file the guardianship petition immediately, and Margaret would lose her window to escape. So Margaret made the painful decision to leave her daughter a letter explaining everything, providing copies of all the evidence she'd found, and begging Emily to understand why she had to go. On Thursday morning, while Brandon was at work and Diane was at her weekly bridge club meeting, Margaret put her plan into motion. She'd already arranged for Rosa to pick her up. She'd already signed the lease on a small senior apartment she could barely afford, but that would be hers, all hers, with a lock that Brandon didn't have a key to. She was packing the last few items when she heard a sound. She turned to find 3-year-old Lucas standing in the doorway of the storage room, his thumb in his mouth, watching her. "Grandma Maggie, where are you going?" Margaret's heart broke. She knelt down, her knees protesting, and pulled Lucas into a hug. "I'm going to a new house, sweet boy." "Why?" Lucas asked, his little face confused. "Don't you like our house?" "I love your house, because you're in it," Margaret said, fighting tears. "But sometimes grown-ups need to make changes. I'm not going far, though, and I'll still see you, okay? Promise?" Lucas asked. "I promise," Margaret said, praying she could keep that promise, praying that Brandon wouldn't turn Emily against her completely. "Can I come visit?" "I hope so, baby. I really hope so." Margaret heard a car horn outside. Rosa was here. She kissed Lucas's forehead, grabbed her bag, and walked toward the front door. On the kitchen table, she left the letter for Emily, propped against the sugar bowl, where Emily would see it when she got home from work. As she walked out the door, Margaret looked back one more time at the house that had been her home for 2 years, a house where she'd never truly belonged, where she'd been tolerated rather than welcomed, where she'd slowly disappeared into the margins until she'd almost forgotten who she was. She was 72 years old, walking away from her daughter and grandson, with barely $1,000 to her name and no guarantee that anything would work out. But she was free. Rosa pulled away from the curb, and Margaret didn't look back. Emily came home from work at 5:45 p.m. to find Lucas playing in the living room, Diane watching television, and Brandon cooking dinner, something he rarely did, which immediately put her on alert. "Where's Mom?" Emily asked. Brandon didn't turn around from the stove. "Haven't seen her. Probably in her room." Emily walked to the storage room and knocked. No answer. She opened the door and found it empty. The garbage bags were gone. The mattress was bare. Her mother's few belongings had vanished. Panic seized Emily's chest. She ran back to the kitchen. "Where is she? Where's my mother?" "I told you, I don't know," Brandon said. "She was here this morning when I left for work." Emily spotted the letter on the kitchen table. Her name was written on the envelope in her mother's familiar handwriting. With shaking hands, she opened it. The letter was 5 pages long, written in her mother's careful script. As Emily read, the color drained from her face. "My darling Emily," it began, "I'm writing this letter because I need you to know the truth, and I need you to hear it in my words, not filtered through anyone else." The letter laid out everything. The conversation Margaret had overheard about the guardianship plan, the files she'd found on Brandon's computer, the systematic documentation of false evidence, the plan to institutionalize her and take control of her finances. "I'm leaving," the letter continued, "not because I don't love you, but because I do. I won't let Brandon use me as a weapon against you anymore. I won't be the reason your marriage crumbles. But Emily, my precious daughter, I need you to see the truth about the man you married. I need you to understand that this isn't about his mother needing care or space constraints or me being difficult. This is about control. This is about a man who sees people as obstacles to be removed rather than human beings to be respected." The letter ended with, "I will always be your mother. I will always love you. But I can't stay in a house where I'm being actively plotted against. I hope someday you'll understand. I hope someday you'll forgive me. And I hope, more than anything, that you'll find the strength to stand up for yourself the way I'm finally learning to stand up for me. All my love, always, Mom." Attached to the letter were printouts of photos, screenshots of the documents Margaret had found on Brandon's computer, the guardianship petition, the documentation of false evidence, all of it. Emily stood in her kitchen, the letter trembling in her hands, feeling like the floor was falling away beneath her. "What does it say?" Brandon asked, moving toward her. Emily looked up at her husband, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Were you planning to have my mother declared incompetent?" Brandon's face went through several expressions: surprise, calculation, then defensive anger. "Emily, whatever she told you is clearly the result of her declining mental state. This is exactly what I was worried about. She's becoming paranoid." "Stop," Emily said, her voice stronger now. "Just stop. She has proof, photos of files on your computer, files you created, Brandon, a guardianship petition with your name on it." Brandon's expression changed to something cold and calculating. "I was researching options for her own good. She's not capable of living independently, Emily. You know that. She seemed perfectly capable of planning an escape from you. Emily shot back. She seemed perfectly capable of documenting everything you were doing to her. She's manipulating you, Brandon said, his voice hard. This is what she does. She plays the victim, makes you feel guilty, turns you against me. Don't you see what she's doing? From the living room, Diane chimed in. Emily, dear, I'm sure your mother is confused. Perhaps we should call Adult Protective Services. She shouldn't be out there alone if she's having delusions. Get out, Emily said quietly. Diane blinked. What? Get out, Emily screamed, startling Lucas, who began to cry. Get out of my house. Get out of my mother's room. Pack your things and leave. Emily, you're being hysterical, Brandon said, reaching for her. Emily jerked away from him. Don't touch me. Don't you dare touch me. She looked at Brandon with new eyes, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. How long? How long have you been planning this? There's no plan, Brandon insisted. You're overreacting. I trusted you, Emily continued, her voice breaking. I chose you over her again and again. When you moved her to the storage room, when you spoke to her disrespectfully, when you made her feel like a burden, I told myself you were just stressed, that you didn't mean it. But you did mean it. You meant all of it. You were systematically destroying her so you could get rid of her. She's a drain on our resources, Brandon finally admitted, his mask slipping. On our time, our money, our energy. I was trying to solve a problem in a way that wouldn't make you feel guilty. I was trying to protect you from having to make the hard choice. The hard choice, Emily repeated hollowly. You mean choosing between my husband and my mother, a choice you engineered by making it impossible for her to stay. Someone had to be practical, Brandon said. You're too emotional about this. You can't see clearly. I see perfectly clearly, Emily interrupted. I see a man who lied to me, who plotted against my mother, who was willing to have her institutionalized to get what he wanted. I see a man I don't recognize anymore. I see a man I'm not sure I ever really knew. Emily, think about what you're saying, Brandon said, a hint of desperation entering his voice. Think about Lucas. Think about our family. I am thinking about Lucas, Emily said, looking at her son, who was crying in confusion. I'm thinking about what kind of man I want him to grow up to be. And it's not you, Brandon. It's not someone who treats elderly people like garbage. It's not someone who sees family as disposable. Emily picked up her phone and dialed. When Carmen Martinez answered, Margaret had included her contact information in the letter. Emily said, This is Emily Whitmore, Margaret Chen's daughter. I need to know where my mother is. And then I need to know how to file for divorce. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. Brandon stared at her, shock evident on his face. You're not serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life, Emily said. Now get your mother out of my house, tonight. This is my house too, Brandon said, anger replacing shock. Then I'll leave, Emily said. Lucas and I will leave tonight, and we'll take everything this letter contains straight to a lawyer and a judge. You want to play games with guardianship and documentation. Let's see how a divorce court feels about your little plan. For the first time in their entire marriage, Emily saw fear in Brandon's eyes. You're making a mistake, he said. No, Emily replied. I'm fixing one. The next 3 months were the hardest of Emily's life. She and Lucas moved in temporarily with Rosa and Margaret while she sorted out the divorce and custody arrangements. Brandon fought her on everything. The house, the assets, custody of Lucas. But when Emily's lawyer presented evidence of Brandon's guardianship plan, and the systematic emotional abuse of Margaret. The judge had been unimpressed with Brandon's behavior. The divorce was bitter. Brandon's family lawyers tried every tactic to paint Emily as unstable, Margaret as manipulative, and Brandon as the victim of an ungrateful family. But the evidence didn't lie. The files on Brandon's computer, the documented plans to institutionalize Margaret, the financial calculations showing how Brandon had planned to profit from controlling Margaret's income. It all painted a picture of a man whose cruelty had been calculated and deliberate. Diane had initially tried to stay involved, claiming she was just an innocent bystander. But testimony from neighbors and Margaret herself revealed that Diane had been complicit in the plan, had actively encouraged Brandon's behavior, and had benefited from Margaret's displacement. Eventually, even Diane's own lawyer suggested she distance herself from her son's actions. The final divorce decree gave Emily primary custody of Lucas, ownership of the house, and a substantial portion of their assets. Brandon was given supervised visitation with Lucas after he completed court-mandated therapy for control issues. The judge had been particularly harsh in his ruling, stating that Brandon's treatment of Margaret showed a pattern of elder abuse and exploitation that brings into question his judgment and character. But Emily's victory felt hollow. She'd lost 2 years to a man who'd manipulated her, isolated her from her mother, and nearly destroyed her family. She'd been so desperate to maintain peace, so afraid of conflict, so convinced she could fix everything, that she'd allowed her mother to be mistreated in ways that made Emily physically sick to remember. One evening, 6 months after Margaret had left, Emily sat with her mother in the kitchen of the house that was now legally Emily's, the house Margaret had finally moved back into, this time with a beautiful bedroom on the main floor with her own bathroom, decorated exactly how she wanted it. "I'm so sorry, Mom," Emily said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry for everything I let happen to you. I chose him over you again and again. I was a terrible daughter." Margaret reached across the table and took Emily's hands. "You were a daughter trying to hold her family together. You were a woman trying to be loyal to her husband. Those instincts aren't wrong, Emily. Brandon twisted them and used them against you." "I should have seen it sooner," Emily said. "All the signs were there. Manipulation works because good people don't want to believe someone they love is capable of evil." Margaret replied, "That's not your fault, but I hurt you. God, Mom, I let him put you in a storage room. I let him treat you like you were nothing. How can you even forgive me?" Margaret smiled sadly. "Because I remember being young and in love. I remember how hard it is to see clearly when you're in the middle of it. And because, my darling girl, you made the right choice when it mattered most. When you saw the truth, you didn't make excuses. You acted. You protected yourself and Lucas. You stood up to him. That took more courage than you know." "I drove you out of your home," Emily whispered. "No," Margaret said firmly. "Brandon drove me out. You brought me back. There's a difference." They sat together in silence for a moment. Then Emily asked, "Do you think you'll ever trust me again? Really trust me?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I trust that you love me. I trust that you'll do better in the future because you've learned from the past. And I trust that our relationship is stronger now because we've been through this fire and come out the other side." She squeezed Emily's hands. "That's enough." Emily nodded, wiping her tears. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making this up to you." "You don't have to make anything up to me," Margaret said. "Just promise me something. Promise me you'll teach Lucas to respect his elders, to value family, and to stand up against cruelty, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. I promise, Emily said, and promise me you'll never lose yourself in another relationship again. Promise me you'll remember your own worth. I promise, Emily repeated. 2 years after Brandon had thrown out Margaret's things and moved Diane into her room, the house had transformed. Margaret's room was warm and inviting, filled with photos and books, and a comfortable chair where she sat reading to Lucas every evening. Emily had quit her high-stress job and started her own marketing consulting business from home, giving her flexibility to be present for her son and her mother. Lucas was thriving, a happy, kind 5-year-old who adored his grandmother and had no memory of the tension that had once filled the house. Brandon had moved to another state and had minimal contact with Lucas, which Emily had mixed feelings about. Part of her grieved that Lucas didn't have an active father, but another part of her was relieved that Lucas wasn't being raised by a man who saw people as obstacles to be managed rather than humans to be loved. Diane had eventually apologized, a stilted, awkward apology that Margaret had accepted gracefully, even though they both knew it wasn't entirely sincere. They maintained a distant but cordial relationship for Lucas's sake. On the 2nd anniversary of the day, Margaret had walked out. Rosa threw a party. It was small, just Rosa's family, Margaret, Emily, Lucas, and a few close friends. But it was filled with laughter and love. As the evening wound down and Lucas fell asleep in Margaret's lap, Rosa raised her glass. "To Margaret," she said, "who taught us all that it's never too late to stand up for yourself. And to Emily, who showed us it's never too late to choose what's right." Everyone raised their glasses, and Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but these were good tears, happy tears. Later, as she tucked Lucas into bed and watched Emily kiss their grandson goodnight, Margaret thought about how far they'd all come. She thought about the scared, humiliated woman who'd sat on that bare mattress in the storage room 2 years ago, feeling worthless and discarded. She thought about the broken relationship with Emily that had seemed beyond repair, and she thought about where they were now, healed, whole, stronger for having survived. Life hadn't been easy. Margaret's small apartment during those first months had been lonely. The legal battles had been exhausting. Rebuilding trust with Emily had been painful. There had been setbacks and hard days, and moments when Margaret had wondered if she'd made the right choice by leaving. But standing here now, in a home where she was valued and loved, watching her daughter tuck her grandson into bed with so much tenderness, Margaret knew that every hard moment had been worth it. She'd reclaimed her dignity. She'd saved her daughter from a toxic marriage. She'd taught her grandson that family meant respect, not control. And in doing so, she'd learned something powerful. You're never too old to start over. You're never too dependent to demand respect. And love, real love, doesn't ask you to diminish yourself to make room for others. As she walked to her beautiful bedroom, the one with her books arranged just so, her photos on the walls, her comfortable chair by the window, Margaret smiled. Brandon had thrown out her things and tried to throw her out of her daughter's life, but in the end, all he'd done was throw away his own family, and that was a regret he'd have to live with for the rest of his life. Margaret stood in the community center, looking out at the crowd of faces, some young, some old, some scared, some hopeful. She'd been volunteering here for the past year, working with the Elder Advocacy Program, helping other older adults who found themselves in situations similar to what she'd experienced. Today, She was giving a talk about recognizing elder abuse and knowing your rights. I was 72 years old when my son-in-law tried to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could control my life. Margaret began, her voice steady and strong. I was living in a storage room, sleeping on a mattress on the floor, feeling like I had no options and no future. I was convinced I was a burden. I believed I deserved to be treated as less than human because I was old, because I was dependent, because I needed help. She paused, making eye contact with an elderly woman in the front row who was crying quietly. But I was wrong. Age doesn't diminish your value. Need doesn't erase your rights. Dependency doesn't mean you deserve abuse. I learned that the hard way, but I learned it. And now I'm here to tell you, if you're in a situation where you're being mistreated, where you're being controlled, where you're being made to feel worthless, there is a way out. It won't be easy. It might be the hardest thing you ever do, but you deserve dignity. You deserve respect, and you are never too old to reclaim your life. The applause was thunderous. After her talk, people lined up to speak with her. They shared their stories, adult children who controlled their money, caregivers who were cruel, family members who treated them as inconveniences. Margaret listened to each one, offered resources, shared Carmen's contact information, and most importantly, told them they weren't alone. Among the people waiting to talk to her was a young woman, maybe 30, holding the hand of an elderly man. "Mrs. Chen," the woman said, "I'm Sarah Bradford. This is my grandfather, Joseph. We saw your story online. There was an article about your case, and I just wanted to say thank you. My uncle was trying to do to my grandfather exactly what your son-in-law tried to do to you. But because of your story, because you spoke out, we knew what to look for. We were able to stop it before it got too far. You saved my grandfather's life." Margaret felt tears well up as she looked at Joseph, who smiled at her with gratitude shining in his eyes. "You did the hard work," Margaret said. "You stood up for him. That's all that matters. But we wouldn't have known to look if you hadn't shared your story," Sarah insisted. "You turned your pain into purpose. That's incredible." After everyone had left and Margaret was gathering her things, Emily appeared with Lucas, now 7 years old and carrying a bouquet of flowers. "You were amazing, Grandma," Lucas said, handing her the flowers. "When I grow up, I want to help people like you do." Margaret hugged her grandson tight. "Then I'll have done my job right." Emily smiled at her mother, and in that smile was everything: pride, love, gratitude, and respect. "Ready to go home?" Emily asked. Margaret took one last look at the community center, at the space where she'd just helped educate and empower others who were facing the same battles she'd fought. "Yes," she said, taking Lucas's hand on one side and Emily's on the other. "Let's go home." And as they walked to the car together, 3 generations bound by love, tested by fire, and strengthened by survival, Margaret knew that every moment of pain, every tear, every doubt had led to this. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, home. The end. What did you think of Margaret's story? Have you or someone you know experienced elder abuse? What would you have done in Margaret's situation? Drop a comment below with your thoughts. And if this story moved you, hit that subscribe button, because everyone deserves to hear stories that remind us of the power of standing up for what's right. No matter how old we are, your voice matters, your story matters, and you are never too old to reclaim your dignity. Thank you for reading. Now go hug your parents, grandparents, or elders in your life and remind them they're valued.